Every ranch hand in Silverpine Valley claimed the building had been abandoned for 2 decades. Some said it was cursed. Others simply crossed themselves whenever they rode past. Yet as the golden light of an autumn evening settled over the Colorado mountains, one weary cowboy would hear something no one else believed still existed. He would hear someone singing. Before we ride into today's story, if you enjoy heartfelt Western tales filled with mystery, courage, and hope, we'd be honored to have you join our frontier family. Subscribe and ride with us for more unforgettable journeys across the American West. Now let's return to Silverpine Valley in the autumn of 1901. Nathan Walker guided his bay gelding slowly down the narrow mountain trail, the horse's steady hoofbeats echoing against the rocky hillsides. At 44 years old, Nathan had spent more of his life beneath open skies than beneath any roof. His weathered brown trail coat carried the dust of countless miles, while his faded black cowboy hat shaded calm blue eyes that noticed far more than they ever revealed. Ahead, nestled beneath towering cottonwood trees glowing with amber leaves, lay Silverpine Valley. It was the sort of frontier town that seemed determined to hold on while the rest of the world hurried forward. Smoke drifted from stone chimneys. Children chased one another beside wooden storefronts. Blacksmith hammers rang through the crisp mountain air. Ranch wagons rolled slowly across the dusty street as townsfolk exchanged quiet greetings beneath fading afternoon sunlight. Nathan dismounted outside the general store, tying his horse beside a watering trough. The storekeeper, an older man polishing a lantern, nodded politely. Passing through, Nathan smiled. For a few days, the old man looked him over before speaking again. Plenty of work around these parts if you're willing. Nathan thanked him and accepted directions toward the boarding house. As he continued down the main street, something caught his eye. At the edge of town stood an old wooden church. Its white paint had long since faded to gray. Broken shutters hung crookedly beside tall windows clouded with dust. Weeds grew through cracked stone steps, leading to heavy oak doors scarred by weather and time. A weather-beaten cross still rested atop the steeple, leaning slightly but refusing to fall. Nathan slowed. Even neglected, the building carried a quiet dignity. He tipped his hat toward a woman sweeping her porch nearby. That an old church? The broom stopped moving. Her smile disappeared. It was. Nathan noticed 2 ranch hands loading hay onto a wagon. They exchanged uneasy glances. One finally answered. "Best leave it alone." Nathan raised an eyebrow. "Why?" The younger ranch hand shrugged. "No one's gone inside for 20 years. Another townsman overheard the conversation and walked closer, lowering his voice. "Folks around here don't go near that place after sunset." Nathan looked back toward the church. "It looks empty." "It is. So why avoid it?" No one answered immediately. The silence stretched longer than seemed comfortable. Finally, the older ranch hand removed his gloves and quietly said, "Some doors are better left closed." Nathan had heard stories like that across half the frontier. Every town had its abandoned mine, its haunted cabin, its lonely trail. Fear often grew where answers had been forgotten. Still, there was something different about the way these people looked at the church. Not terror, sadness. As though the building reminded them of something they wished they could remember differently. Nathan thanked them without pressing further. He spent the afternoon helping unload supplies at the livery stable, earning enough for supper and a room at the boarding house. Yet throughout the day, his eyes kept wandering toward the old church standing alone, beyond the last row of buildings. Evening settled gently across Silverpine Valley. Golden sunlight slipped behind the Rockies, painting the sky with shades of orange, crimson, and deep violet. Cool mountain air carried the scent of pine and wood smoke through quiet streets as townsfolk closed shutters and lit lanterns one by one. Nathan found himself walking toward the edge of town. He wasn't entirely sure why. Perhaps simple curiosity. Perhaps something quieter. The old church stood motionless against the glowing sky. Its broken windows reflected the last rays of sunlight. Dry leaves skittered across the stone steps. Everything appeared exactly as abandoned as everyone had claimed. Nathan rested one hand on the weathered fence surrounding the churchyard. The valley had grown almost completely silent. Then, a voice. Soft, gentle, singing. Nathan froze. The melody drifted through the cool evening air, so clearly that it seemed impossible to mistake. It wasn't loud, it wasn't eerie, it was warm, peaceful, and filled with quiet reverence, like an old frontier hymn carried by someone who had sung it 1,000 times before. He looked around. No one else stood nearby. The singing continued. It was coming from inside the church. Nathan slowly climbed the cracked stone steps. Each wooden board creaked beneath his boots. The heavy oak doors stood closed, their iron hinges dark with age. The song floated through the narrow gap beneath them. His weathered hand reached for the worn brass handle. For a long moment, he simply listened. Then, with slow, careful movement, Nathan pushed the old church door open. The ancient hinges groaned softly into the quiet evening. He peered into the dim interior. His voice barely rose above a whisper. "Someone's still here." Nathan's whisper disappeared into the stillness. "Someone's still here." The gentle singing came to a peaceful close. Silence filled the sanctuary once again. Nathan stepped carefully across the worn wooden floor, every board creaking beneath his boots. Moonlight filtered through cracked stained glass windows, painting faded colors across rows of dust-covered pews. Cobwebs hung from the old chandeliers, yet despite 20 years of neglect, the room felt strangely alive. Near the altar, one lantern burned softly. Beside it stood an elderly man. His silver hair caught the lantern's glow beneath a weathered black minister's coat. A full gray beard framed a gentle face marked by years of quiet endurance. Though thin with age, he stood straight, his kind blue eyes meeting Nathan's without the slightest fear. For several moments neither man spoke. Finally, the old preacher smiled. I wondered how long it would take before someone followed the music. Nathan slowly removed his hat. I hope I'm not intruding. Not at all. The elderly man stepped forward. My name is Elijah Brooks. Nathan Walker. They shook hands. Elijah's grip remained surprisingly firm. Nathan looked around the sanctuary. I was told nobody had entered this church for 20 years. Elijah glanced toward the empty pews. That is what most folks believe. Nathan frowned. But you've been here. The old preacher nodded gently. Every Sunday, Nathan looked around again. The lantern. Fresh firewood stacked beside the stove. A recently swept aisle. Someone had quietly cared for this church all along. You've done this alone? For 20 years. Nathan struggled to imagine such devotion. Why? Elijah rested one hand upon the old wooden pulpit. Because a church isn't abandoned simply because people stop coming. His quiet answer settled deep within Nathan. Outside, the wind brushed softly against the weathered walls. Inside, peace seemed to linger in every corner. Nathan finally asked the question that had followed him since entering town. What happened here? Before Elijah could answer, footsteps approached outside. The front door opened quietly. A woman entered carrying a small wicker basket. She paused the instant she noticed Nathan. Her chestnut-brown hair rested neatly inside a simple braid over one shoulder. She wore a faded forest-green prairie dress beneath a warm wool shawl, and her gentle hazel eyes widened with surprise. You have company. Elijah smiled. It appears we do. Nathan tipped his hat respectfully. The woman returned the gesture. I'm Sarah Collins. Nathan Walker. She looked toward the open church doors. I suppose someone finally heard the singing. Nathan smiled faintly. I did. Sarah placed the basket beside the altar. Inside were fresh bread, apples, and a small jar of preserves. I bring Reverend Brooks supper every Sunday. Nathan looked between them. So the whole town doesn't know? Sarah slowly shook her head. No. Nathan hesitated. They all think this place has been empty. Elijah answered quietly. Sometimes people find it easier to stay away from painful memories. Nathan waited. Sarah slowly walked toward one of the front pews. Her eyes drifted across the faded sanctuary. 20 years ago, This church was the heart of Silverpine Valley. She smiled sadly. Every pew was full. Children sang here. Weddings were celebrated here. Families gathered every Sunday. Her voice grew softer. Then came the mountain fever. Nathan listened without interrupting. It swept through the valley during one terrible winter. Entire families disappeared within months. The church held funeral after funeral. Eventually, people stopped coming. Elijah lowered his head. They blamed the building. Sarah nodded. They said the church reminded them of everything they'd lost. So one family stopped attending. Then another. And another. Until finally, no one came at all. Nathan looked across the empty pews. He could almost imagine them filled with grieving families unable to bear returning. So you've kept it alive. Elijah smiled gently. Someone had to. Nathan noticed the old Bible resting neatly upon the pulpit. Fresh flowers had been placed beside it. Even after 2 lonely decades, hope had never completely left this room. The old preacher looked toward Nathan. You asked earlier why I stayed. Nathan nodded. Elijah answered quietly. I always believed one day someone would walk through those doors again. Nathan smiled. I suppose you were right. The old preacher chuckled softly. I've learned never to underestimate God's timing. Outside, moonlight settled over the valley. The old church no longer felt forgotten. It simply felt patient. Nathan remained longer than he intended. Together they lit another lantern, repaired a loose hymn rack, straightened several pews. None of them hurried. The work felt strangely natural. As they prepared to leave, Sarah stepped onto the porch beside Nathan. Cold mountain air carried the scent of pine through the quiet valley. She looked toward the sleeping town below. They're good people. Nathan nodded. I believe that. They're just afraid. Afraid of remembering. Nathan looked back toward the church. Maybe remembering isn't always something to fear. Sarah smiled for the first time that evening. I was hoping someone else might say that. The following morning, Nathan returned before sunrise. He found Elijah already sweeping the front steps. Without saying a word, Nathan picked up another broom, leaning against the wall. The old preacher smiled knowingly. The work had only just begun. Several hours later, while repairing one of the broken porch rails, Nathan noticed a rider approaching from town. The horse was sleek, the saddle expensive. Its rider wore a perfectly tailored black frock coat beneath a spotless black cowboy hat. He dismounted with the confidence of a man accustomed to getting his way. Sarah stepped outside the church at the same moment. The stranger smiled politely. My name is Victor Hale. He removed several folded legal papers from a leather case. I've come regarding this property. He unfolded the documents, then looked directly at Sarah and Reverend Brooks. His smile never faded. In 3 days, this church belongs to me. Victor Hale's smile never wavered. In 3 days, this church belongs to me. The words settled over the old churchyard like an early frost. Sarah Collins stared at the legal papers in disbelief. Reverend Elijah Brooks remained calm, though the sadness in his gentle blue eyes deepened. Nathan Walker slowly stepped down from the church porch. He looked directly at Victor. On what grounds? Victor adjusted his gloves before answering. The property has been abandoned. He tapped the folded documents. Under county law, land left unused for 20 consecutive years may be purchased through public claim. Nathan glanced toward the church behind him. It hasn't been abandoned. Victor smiled again. It certainly looks abandoned. Sarah spoke quietly but firmly. This church has never been forgotten. Victor shrugged. Unfortunately, the county records disagree. He returned the papers to his leather case. In 3 days, the transfer becomes official. He tipped his hat politely. I suggest removing anything of sentimental value before then. Without another word, he mounted his horse and rode back toward Silverpine Valley. The sound of hoofbeats slowly disappeared. Silence returned. Sarah lowered her eyes. We can't lose this place. Reverend Brooks rested one weathered hand against the old church door. I've waited 20 years. I can wait 3 more days. Nathan looked from one face to the other. No. Both turned toward him. We're not waiting. Tuck. Before sunrise the next morning, Nathan saddled his bay gelding. Sheriff Owen Briggs met him outside the county office. The sheriff's thick gray mustache twitched thoughtfully as Nathan explained everything. When he finished, Owen removed his hat. I've known Reverend Brooks nearly 30 years. If that church belongs to anyone, it belongs to this town. Nathan nodded. So where do we begin? The county archives. So, inside the Silverpine courthouse, rows of towering wooden shelves stretched toward the ceiling. Leather-bound ledgers, survey maps, property deeds. Dust covered nearly everything. The elderly county clerk adjusted his spectacles as Nathan explained what they needed. The original church deed? The old man frowned. I haven't seen that file in years. He led them toward the oldest shelves. One by one they searched. Morning became afternoon. Afternoon became evening. Boxes were opened. Ledgers carefully examined. Cabinets emptied. Nothing. Finally, the clerk slowly lowered one final book onto the desk. It should be here. He pointed toward an empty space. The file's gone. Sheriff Briggs frowned. Gone? The clerk nodded sadly. It didn't disappear by accident. Nathan exchanged a quiet glance with the sheriff. Someone had removed it. So, as the 3 men left the courthouse, Nathan couldn't stop thinking about something Sarah had said. People abandoned the church, but Reverend Brooks never had. If Elijah stayed, perhaps others had left something behind. That evening, Nathan returned to the church. Sarah greeted him on the porch. No luck? He slowly shook his head. The records are missing. She sighed. I was afraid of that. Reverend Brooks listened quietly before speaking. When I first came here, the church kept careful journals. Nathan looked toward him. Journals? Everything was recorded. Baptisms, weddings, property donations, repairs. Nathan's eyes brightened. Where are they? Elijah looked toward the sanctuary. I don't know. The last pastor hid many important documents after the fever. No one ever found them. Nathan looked around the old building. If someone wanted to protect the church, where would they hide its history? Sorry. The following morning, sunlight filtered through broken stained glass windows as Nathan carefully examined every corner of the sanctuary. Sarah dusted old hymn books. Emma Collins happily polished wooden pews. Even Reverend Brooks smiled as life slowly returned to the forgotten church. Nathan studied the altar. Something seemed different. The wooden platform beneath it looked newer than the surrounding floor. He knelt. Running his hand across the boards, he noticed faint tool marks. One plank moved slightly. Nathan? Sarah watched curiously. He reached for a pry bar resting beside the stove. Carefully, slowly, the board lifted. Beneath it rested a narrow wooden compartment untouched for decades. Dust covered everything inside. Nathan reached carefully into the darkness. One by one, he lifted several weathered leather-bound journals wrapped inside oilcloth. Reverend Brooks gasped softly. I remember those. Nathan carefully opened the first journal. Its pages remained remarkably well preserved. Beautiful handwritten entries filled every page. Church finances, community meetings, land donations. Sarah gently turned another page. Suddenly she froze. Nathan. He looked down. Folded carefully between 2 pages rested an old parchment bearing the official county seal. Sheriff Briggs, who had arrived only moments earlier, carefully unfolded it. His experienced eyes widened immediately. This isn't just a church journal. Everyone leaned closer. The sheriff read silently for several seconds, then looked towards Sarah. This is the original community trust. Sarah blinked. The what? The church wasn't privately owned. It was donated. He continued reading. Placed into permanent trust. 2. For the people of Silverpine Valley. Nathan smiled. So Victor Hale can't buy it. Sheriff Briggs folded the parchment carefully. If this document is genuine, he doesn't have a legal claim. Hope slowly returned to every face inside the old church. Emma hugged her mother. Reverend Brooks quietly closed his eyes in grateful prayer. Nathan looked toward the dusty windows where sunlight now filled the sanctuary more brightly than ever before. After 20 years, the church had finally revealed the truth it had been protecting all along. Sheriff Briggs tucked the trust document safely inside his coat. He smiled toward Nathan, then quietly said, "Tomorrow, the whole town needs to hear this." Sheriff Owen Briggs carefully folded the weathered community trust and slipped it inside his coat. He looked toward Nathan Walker with quiet confidence. "Tomorrow, the whole town needs to hear this." Morning arrived beneath a sky of brilliant blue. Sunlight spilled across the valley, turning the golden cottonwood leaves into rivers of light. For the first time in many years, people gathered outside the old frontier church. Ranchers, shopkeepers, blacksmiths, teachers, children, families who had not walked through those church doors since the terrible winter 20 years before. Some came because of curiosity, others because Sheriff Briggs had personally asked them to attend. Many arrived simply because something inside them hoped. Nathan stood quietly beside Reverend Elijah Brooks on the weathered church porch. Sarah Collins held Emma's hand while looking across the growing crowd. The old church no longer seemed forgotten. It simply waited. Turek. A short time later, the sound of approaching hoofbeats echoed across the churchyard. Victor Hale rode confidently toward the gathering. He dismounted with the same calm smile he had worn the day before. "I see everyone came to say goodbye." No one answered. Sheriff Briggs stepped forward instead. "Mr. Hale." Victor nodded politely. "Sheriff, I understand you've come to finalize your purchase." Victor removed his leather case. "I have." Before he could continue, Sheriff Briggs carefully unfolded the weathered parchment recovered beneath the altar. The county seal caught the morning sunlight. Victor's confident expression barely changed until he saw the document. Sheriff Briggs spoke clearly enough for the entire valley to hear. This church was never abandoned. It was legally placed into a permanent community trust. He raised the parchment. "The trust cannot be sold, it cannot be transferred, and it cannot be claimed through abandonment." A quiet murmur swept through the crowd. Victor stepped closer. "Where did you find that?" Nathan answered calmly. "Exactly where it had been protected for 20 years. Victor quickly examined the parchment. His confident smile slowly disappeared. Every signature matched. Every county seal remained intact. Every page had been officially recorded. There could be no argument. Judge Samuel Hart, who had quietly arrived from town after receiving Sheriff Briggs' message, carefully inspected the document himself. Several long minutes passed. Finally, he closed the parchment, then looked directly at Victor Hale. "This trust is valid. The church belongs to the people of Silverpine Valley." Victor lowered his eyes. For the first time, he had nothing left to say. Judge Hart folded the document and returned it to Sheriff Briggs. "Your claim is denied." The decision was final. Silence lingered for only a heartbeat. Then something remarkable happened. One elderly woman slowly climbed the church steps. She paused before the open doorway. Tears filled her eyes. "I was baptized here." An older rancher removed his hat. "I was married here." Another quietly whispered, "My parents are buried behind this church." One by one, families crossed the threshold. Children stepped inside. Grandparents followed. Neighbors who had spent 20 years avoiding painful memories suddenly found themselves walking home again. No one rushed. Some quietly touched the old pews. Others simply stood inside the sanctuary, remembering. Dust no longer seemed like neglect. It looked like time patiently waiting. Class. The days that followed transformed the old church. Broken windows were repaired. Fresh white paint covered weathered walls. New cedar shingles replaced the leaking roof. The cracked front steps were rebuilt stone by stone. Ranchers donated lumber. Blacksmiths repaired iron hinges. Carpenters restored pews. Women sewed new curtains. Children planted flowers beside the churchyard fence. No one asked for payment. Everyone simply worked. Nathan worked beside them every day. He repaired the bell tower, straightened the leaning cross, built new benches for the churchyard. Whenever someone thanked him, he simply smiled. This place belonged to all of you. One Sunday morning, nearly the entire valley gathered inside the restored church. Sunlight streamed through newly cleaned stained glass windows, filling the sanctuary with brilliant colors. Every pew was occupied, exactly as they had been before the tragedy. Reverend Elijah Brooks slowly walked toward the pulpit. For several moments, emotion prevented him from speaking. He looked across faces he thought he would never see again. Finally, he smiled. "Welcome home." Many quietly wiped away tears. Sarah reached for Emma's hand. Nathan removed his black cowboy hat. Outside, the old church bell stood silent. Reverend Brooks looked toward Nathan. "I believe you should do the honors." Nathan hesitated. "I couldn't." "You can." The old preacher gently placed the bell rope into Nathan's weathered hands. Nathan looked toward the valley, toward the mountains, toward every family gathered inside. Then he slowly pulled. The ancient bell rang once. Its deep voice rolled across Silverpine Valley. Again and again. The sound echoed through forests, ranches, hillsides, and open pastures. For the first time in 20 years, the church bells called the valley home. Many smiled, many cried. Some simply closed their eyes and listened. Hope had found its voice again. Far. As the congregation stood together, Reverend Brooks began singing the same old frontier hymn Nathan had first heard drifting through the autumn evening. This time, he did not sing alone. Sarah joined him. Emma's young voice followed. Then another. Soon the entire church filled with song. The lonely melody that had once echoed through empty pews now rose from grateful hearts. Nathan quietly stood near the back of the sanctuary. He removed his hat once more. Sometimes, we discover that abandoned places are not truly empty. They are simply waiting for someone brave enough to open the door. The old frontier church was no longer silent. Its windows glowed with light. Its bell rang with joy. Its people had returned. And in Silverpine Valley, faith, friendship, and hope found their home once again. Thank you for riding with us through another unforgettable journey across the Old West. If this story touched your heart, we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe for more heartfelt Western stories, and we'll see you on the next trail.